Welcome, everybody, to episode 19 of Generation Jihad. I'm Tom Joscelyn, and I'm joined again, as always, this week by my colleague Bill Roggio. Bill.
Hi, everyone.
We are senior fellows at the Foundation for Defensive Democracies, and we've been running FDD's Long War Journal for more than 12 years now. I always stumble on that. I don't know why. I don't even know exactly how long we've been doing this, but it's been a long time. And throughout that entire time, of course, we started off by covering Al Qaeda and America's wars in response to the 9/11 attacks and the Iraq War and related issues. And this week we thought maybe we'd sort of do a brief survey of where Al Qaeda stands in the year 2020. And it's an interesting, complicated question. I sat down, Bill, to prepare for this week's episode, and I wanted to do, sometimes we do these show notes where we try and outline what we're going to say to try and rein in all of our thoughts on this stuff. The problem I have with this topic is it's such a big topic that basically we could record probably 10 episodes of the podcast on this, and I still probably wouldn't say or get to everything we wanted to say or get to. So where is Al Qaeda in 2020 and what are they doing? Well, the first thing you confront when you start to answer this question is that there's still not a common definition or widely accepted definition of what Al Qaeda actually is or how it's structured, how it functions. And we're going to get into that a little bit in terms of going through all this. But let's start from the top, with the man at the top, in fact, the number one Al Qaeda guy in the plan, Ayman Al-Zawahiri. He's still in the game. He's still alive. According to General McKenzie, the CENTCOM commander, he's in eastern Afghanistan. He still has followers across multiple countries, multiple groups that are part of the Al Qaeda sort of hydra are loyal to him, openly loyal to him. And one of the things, Bill, you and I talk about a lot is, or have in the past, is that, there's this reflexive desire to dismiss Aohiri and say that he's sort of, he lacks the charisma of Osama bin Laden, so therefore he's an ineffectual leader. And of course, he had problems with ISIS and the rise of ISIS, and he's had other management problems through the years for sure. But one of the things about Ayman Al-Zawahiri he deserves a little bit of credit for, first and foremost, is he survived all these years, right? I mean, I don't know if you could have, Bill, do you think you could have survived the massive manhunt for him? I mean, if you think about it, he was in jail, imprisoned by the Egyptians in the 80s. He briefly detained by the Russians in the 90s, but he's had multiple governments gunning for him, chiefly the United States of America, for many years now, decades. And he's still in the game. The old man, the old Egyptian is still in the game.
Yeah, I think that speaks to Al Qaeda's organization. It's survivability. I mean, look, it took us 10 years to kill Osama bin Laden. It wound up, he, of course, was sheltering in a compound in outside of Pakistan's, basically with their version of West Point in Abbottabad. And where is Aohiri today? Well, the U.S. military, again, as you said, seems to think he's in eastern Afghanistan. Look, the U.S. military has not necessarily a strong footprint in Afghanistan, but a strong enough footprint that if it wanted to organize and go after him, it could. It could also pull in resources from outside to do so. And yet, if the U.S. military believes that he's in eastern Afghanistan, they're unable to get him. And I think that speaks to, again, Al Qaeda has a network here that is able to provide security and not just survive, but he's able to manage the organization. Say, you would mention he's criticized for allowing these, the schism with the Islamic State. Look, Zawahiri actually ejected the Islamic State from Al Qaeda. But he still commands respect from senior jihadists. Al Qaeda's branches still exist, and they still report to him and provide money and support for Al Qaeda's central command. And it is amazing that 19 plus years after 9/11, Al Qaeda, who started out as Al Qaeda's number 2 and is now Al Qaeda's number 1, he's still out there.
There's this idea that I've seen in different places that, basically the Egyptian Islamic Jihad wasn't really part of Al Qaeda until 2001. There are different dates for the merger between Zawahiri's outfit and bin Laden's outfit. I've always been puzzled by this, because if you go back through the history of this and you go through the 9/11 Commission report, or you go through district court records, you go through various different primary source accounts, it's clear that Zawahiri was joined at the hip with bin Laden very early on, and that it was his Egyptian Islamic Jihad operatives that really laid the groundwork and helped plan, with assistance from Hezbollah and Iran, by the way, for the 1998 U.S. embassy bombings, which were the biggest attack by Al Qaeda before 9/11, the most devastating attack. And you could see that type of cooperation throughout the 1990s. Whenever you date the formal merger of the EIJ with Al Qaeda, it's clear that Zawahiri and his men were deeply in bed with Al Qaeda and bin Laden and were part of it. And I always compare it to sort of like the ExxonMobil merger, you know? I mean, if you look at it, you know, it's like somebody saying, well, Mobil wasn't really part of ExxonMobil until they became ExxonMobil. Well, Mobil was always Mobil, you know? And, you know, yeah, maybe the formal merger was when they became one and they're officially joined banners under the same name. But behind the scenes, you know, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, Zawahiri, they were always EIJ. They were always anti-American terrorists going way back in time. And they were part of this Al Qaeda merger very early on, even if it was unannounced.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is part of what we've just called the disconnect the dots paradigm that we constantly have to deal with. Like, what is the difference between Egyptian Islamic Jihad prior to a formal merger than after? As you explained, I think the ExxonMobil example you give is absolutely perfect. They were fellow travelers in this case, and
I guess my analogy there is it's not like Mobil was not in the oil business before it became part of ExxonMobil, exactly. Right? You know, I mean, maybe there wasn't cooperation between Exxon and Mobil before they became ExxonMobil, but in this case there was, right? I mean, EIJ and Al Qaeda were joined very early on in all this.
Yeah, I'm trying to think back to the earliest pictures of where bin Laden and Zawahiri are photographed together, right? I mean, it has to span back to the early 1990s, am I correct? I mean, and Al Qaeda even talks about how those two traveled together during the jihad, the jihad against the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. Now, maybe that's a fiction created by Al Qaeda, but that's certainly the impression that they want to give.
You know, and I mentioned Mackenzie saying that Zawahiri is in eastern Afghanistan. We think that's just such a curious thing for him to say, isn't it? Because
it is.
Why do you say it? I mean, you know, if you know he's there, why aren't you going after him? If you can't go after him, right? What does that mean? You know, and you know, why are you letting him know that you know where he is? You know, and then you know, who's harboring him there? Who's he working with? Most likely the Haqqanis, of course, and other Taliban groups. You know, but the point is that when you look at that, you know, it's just a very strange thing to say. Well, we think he's in eastern Afghanistan, but what? You know, you're not redoubling your effort to go get him. There was no punchline. If you go back in time, like think back to like 2002. Imagine a major U.S. military commander, official or U.S. official saying, "Oh, we know Osama bin Laden and Ayman Al-Zawahiri are in Pakistan or wherever." You know, okay, and the punchline is what? I mean, people be like, "So what are you going to do about it?" And yet this was put out there, and there was, outside of us, nobody said, well, what are you going to do about it, right? I mean, it's sort of like, right. You know, we're just going to let them exist there now as we leave. It's like the U.S. has closed 5 military bases in Afghanistan as part of this deal with the Taliban, or supposedly part of the deal with the Taliban. The U.S., by all indications, is leaving Afghanistan. And you're what? You're not going to get him on the way out, or what's the deal?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Tom. I mean, we close 5 U.S. military bases. We pull 4,000 troops out as part of that 135-day deadline of the deal with the Taliban. Shouldn't we be redoubling efforts, keeping those troops inside Afghanistan to help hunt for Zawahiri if we really do believe that he's in eastern Afghanistan? I mean, look, there are one or two very likely things going on here. Either, you know, they don't want to go after him in eastern Afghanistan, or this is the ultimate expression of impotence, in my opinion. They are unable to get him because they're so beholden to a deal with the Taliban that if you get Zawahiri in eastern Afghanistan, then it really brings that entire deal crashing down, because of course he's going to be sheltering with the Taliban, with the Haqqanis, as you note, very likely. And this is why I don't even understand why Mackenzie would say that if either of those two things were true.
So let's go from there. Let's go from Zawahiri is presumably in eastern Afghanistan. Let's work our way inside out when talking about Al Qaeda 2020. So inside being Afghanistan and where this all really started. And I think listeners of our podcast, people who have read us, they know our pessimistic take on all this. They know our skepticism, our criticism of the Taliban deal. So they know what we think about all that. And we don't want to repeat all those arguments here. But, you know, what does Al Qaeda look like in Afghanistan right now? I mean, there are different assessments of how many fighters they have in Afghanistan. But, you know, a common assessment is anywhere from 200 to 600 fighters for Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent and other Al Qaeda fighters. You and I have long argued, right, Bill, that we don't actually know how many fighters they have in Afghanistan. They clearly are there. We just don't know how many they have. And any of these assessments are probably missing all sorts of components to try and tally that all up to really figure that out.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't want to get into the whole 50 to 100 estimate that the controversy that was given for 6 straight years during the Obama
And just as
administration.
background, the U.S. military and the intelligence community said there were only 50 to 100 al-Qaeda guys in Afghanistan from 2010 to basically sometime in 2016. We argued that wasn't true based on what NATO and the U.S. military itself was saying in terms of the reporting on operational raids. But this was a sticky assessment that just held, and just they couldn't get off it. They finally got off it after they raided, the U.S. military and Afghan forces raided these 2 massive training camps in the Shorabah district of Kandahar. They then only basically increased the estimate by the capacity of those camps to say that this was bigger than 50 to 100. But you and I know, we've argued, there's never been a real comprehensive assessment, or hasn't been in quite some time, to actually look at what does the full extent of Al-Qaeda's network inside Afghanistan look like.
Yeah, and that 50 to 100 estimate being maintained for almost 6 years until it was forced to be revised, to me just says that, like you said, there's no serious effort to determine what Al-Qaeda's strength inside Afghanistan was. And as we've noted before, the biases that exist towards, well, if it's not Arab, it's not Al-Qaeda, or if it's not North African, it's not Al-Qaeda. Well, I have a feeling, and I've heard this from some individuals, that there is a serious discounting of Al-Qaeda when it comes to its Afghan, Pakistani, and Central Asian components. So, yeah, I don't think we really know, and I suspect any estimate that's giving is severely estimating Al-Qaeda's strength. History
Underestimating, severely
underestimating. Yes, Al-Qaeda's strength in Afghanistan, and I think that the facts and history bears that out.
And by the way, we don't think that they're going to get this right on the way out the door. So this isn't.
No, absolutely
it's not an argument for anything. It's more of an epistemological observation. But when you talk about the other groups from Central Asia, in other words, you're talking about like the Turkestan Islamic Party, of course, which is filled with Uyghurs. You have the Uzbek groups, the reconstituted portions of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, which sort of was reconfigured and is folded under the Taliban's banner, the IJU, Islamic Jihad Union. You have Tajiks that are jihadis. You have various Pakistani groups have contributed to the cause that are, many of them which are allied with Al-Qaeda or are now part of Al-Qaeda, sort of reconstituted under Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. You basically have, for all these different constituencies or component parts of what Al-Qaeda would look like, that if you were actually trying to figure out what Al-Qaeda is in any one of these years, you'd be adding this all up and saying this is how this all works. And basically what we're saying is nobody's been doing the addition, right? Nobody's pulled out the calculator and say A plus 1 plus 2 plus 3 equals, nobody's been doing that.
Yeah, for instance, look at the Turkestan Islamic Party. It's Amir served as the head at one point in time, and then until he was injured, served as the head of Al-Qaeda's operations chief for Afghanistan, Pakistan, a military commander, basically. He's said to be on one of Al-Qaeda's shuras. So what does that make the head of the TIP, Turkestan Islamic Party, and his followers? Are they a distinct group, or are they part of Al-Qaeda? And these are some of the things that, as you said, are not being tallied.
Yeah, not big tally. So let's go. So in Afghanistan, of course, part of the reason why this has worked for Al-Qaeda is they're fighting under the Taliban's banner. And as we sit here, we're recording this in July. The U.S. has pitched this idea the Taliban's finally going to betray Al-Qaeda. And again, as you've listened to us, we haven't seen any evidence of that. And we're both willing to change our minds the minute we're presented with firm evidence that there's something to change our minds about. But until we see that evidence, forget it. You got to show us something concrete, and we haven't seen anything concrete. And so basically, Al-Qaeda figured out a long time ago that if it just fights under the Taliban's banner, clandestinely and quietly, and doesn't announce everything it's doing, there's going to be a large incentive to pretend that they're not even there. And we're sort of seeing the fruits of that strategy now. And that's very different from ISIS, of course, which, if they have a porta potty set up somewhere in Kunar, they're claiming their province is active and that they're, going at it. And basically they're willing to announce just about everything, whereas Al-Qaeda very rarely announces actual operations in Afghanistan, even though we know they're there for various reasons.
And look, just to remind our listeners, it's been about 5 months since the U.S. signed that deal with the Taliban. And Tom, how many raids have been reported by the Taliban against Al-Qaeda?
Zip. 0.
Okay.
And
Just
how many
checking.
how many times has
Any
the Taliban even admitted that Al Qaeda is in Afghanistan?
Yeah. As
Zero.
a matter of
They're
fact, it says that it
actively
can't
denying
target
it,
Al Qaeda because it doesn't exist inside of Afghanistan.
Poof, we're on. Problem solved, right?
Yeah.
It reminds me of the old George Costanza line.
Jerry, just remember, it's not a lie if you believe it.
That's basically, basically that's people in the State Department now and elsewhere that are willing to believe the lie, So let's go from there. So now we got Afghanistan. We can go on about all the constituent parts. The recent, UN reporting has suggested that the Al Qaeda is actually clandestinely operating in at least 12 different provinces. You and I think it's probably even more than that, of course.
Oh, absolutely.
We've documented their historical footprint there. And one of the reasons why Al Qaeda has been able to survive this war has been its strong alliance and relationship with the Haqqani network. And this is really the Haqqanis. Jalaluddin Haqqani was one of Osama bin Laden's earliest benefactors. His son, Sir Judin Haqqani, has been an Al-Qaeda guy all along. And really, the Haqqanis incubated Al-Qaeda in eastern Afghanistan originally and have remained allied with Al-Qaeda both during the Pakistan years, where they were sort of mostly held up in northern Pakistan together, where the Haqqanis control their strongholds, but also throughout this entire time in Afghanistan. And this is one of those sort of strategic points of strength for Al Qaeda that's been underestimated by the U.S. government. In fact, you can see in the Defense Department's reporting, they say stuff like, "Well, there's nothing strategic to the Taliban Al Qaeda relationship." I say to that, excuse me, I can think of nothing more strategic to Al Qaeda than its relationship with the Taliban, in particular the Haqqanis. And Bill, you were all over the Haqqanis early on and what that meant for all this.
Yeah, I don't understand that. Look, we invade Afghanistan and keep troops there for 19 years because of the Taliban Al Qaeda relationship, which led to the attacks, the 9/11 attacks, and other horrific attacks by Al Qaeda since then.
Which the Taliban blames on us, by the way. Remember, they're still issuing statements and videos blaming the U.S. for 9/11 and other attacks. Our counterterrorism.
Right. We deserved it. Basically, is what the Taliban. It's a slap on the dark faces of the United States, is what the Taliban will say. So they're rubbing in our face as we're genuflecting, as we're prostrating ourselves to them. There's nothing could be more important, as you stated, Tom. It's where it all began, and B, this is, if Zawahiri is operating in eastern Afghanistan, as you noted, it's highly likely, if not certain, that he is doing so with the support of the Haqqani network. And the Haqqanis are not just some criminal group as general that can be negotiated, which the General Flynn long ago stated. I believe that was in 2009.
And he backed off that after, I think we
he did.
We had a little tit for tat with his staff and others about that. Yeah.
Yep. But this is the sort of thing that we've heard over time about the Haqqanis, and yet the Haqqani network is listed as a terrorist organization, and many of its leaders are listed as specially designated global terrorists because of their direct support for Al Qaeda. And lest we forget, Siraj Haqqani isn't just the leader of the Haqqani network. He's one of 2 deputy mayors for the Taliban. This relationship could not be any more strategic, and any claim to the contrary is just merely an attempt to downplay or absolve the Taliban for its ties with
and it's just a good example of how the U.S. lost its way in all this, right? I mean, basically, one of our key points is that the U.S. hasn't really understood this enemy in years, even as American service members have been asked to fight and die in this war. And the U.S. Leadership has been completely confused or befuddled about all this. It really has a real muddled vision of the enemy in Afghanistan. And so that's one of the big problems. So that's Afghanistan. We can go on about that. I think we both think that the Al Qaeda has a more extensive presence, obviously, and have argued than a lot of the common assessments or public assessments of this. Let's go to Pakistan. And boy, I've been thinking about Pakistan a lot recently in all this because, you could see there was this sort of turnabout in the Trump administration where in 2017, the policy was, let's get tough on Pakistan. Let's call out its sponsorship and harboring of the Taliban and other anti-American terrorists. And went from that to now where the U.S. State Department and military are portraying the Pakistan as our peace partners and, as if they're doing something that's, in the interest of peace in Afghanistan. Even though they've never turned on the Haqqanis or any of the senior Taliban leadership, including those that are in bed with Al Qaeda. We've talked about that in previous episodes of the podcast. But here's the open question, Bill, and what are your thoughts on this? What does Al Qaeda look like in Pakistan today? You have the Pakistani Taliban, which is clearly part of the Al Qaeda orbit, but I gotta be worried that the actual Al Qaeda network is more is deeper than we know in Pakistan, and probably in more locations than we know in Pakistan. And isn't this a black box that we're going to be dealing with going forward? And isn't that, as the U.S. leaves the region, isn't that black box going to get even darker?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the correct way to put it. It's become more and more of a black box as the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan, threat to the Pakistani state, has decreased. And I think Al Qaeda's strength is actually growing because of that. So now, and again, I don't want to get I'm not going to spend a long time discussing the good versus bad Taliban paradigm, but basically it's this. There are what the Pakistani states, and this is their own words, called good Taliban. Those are certain Taliban groups that fights in Afghanistan and will back the Pakistani government up against India. And this could also include groups like Pakistani state-sponsored terror groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, and I could go on with the names. And then the bad Taliban is going to be groups like the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan, Islamic Jihad Union, which have carried out attacks against the Pakistani state. The bad Taliban, of course, the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan was responsible for taking over large areas of the federally administrated tribal areas, which used to be known as the federally administrated tribal areas, which are North and South Waziristan and 5 other, now they're all districts. And that was in what was called the Northwest Frontier Province, which is now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. The problem with this paradigm, of course, is that the bad Taliban is supported by the good Taliban, and we get to what Tom calls or coined the term wheel of jihad. So the bad Taliban is supported by the good Taliban, which is supported by the Pakistani state, and the bad Taliban attacks the Pakistani state. Now, the operations of the bad Taliban, or the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan in particular, they've tapered off over the last several years as the Pakistani state has sort of attempted to whittle them back. It doesn't mean they're not still conducting attacks. As a matter of fact, this morning I was just doing some research and looking at attacks in the tribal areas, and they're happening. It's just you're not seeing the reports on them. They're mainly attacks against the military patrols and things of that nature. But I'm also seeing reports of where the Pakistani state is now turning over security in these former tribal areas, again, to what they called these peace councils or peace committees. This is what led to the rise of the movement of the Taliban in
deja
Pakistan.
vu all over again, huh?
Yeah. It's funny, Tom. I just ran across these couple of these reports this morning, and was going, yeah, this is what I think is happening. And but the fact that you don't have this active insurgency against the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan actually allows groups like Al Qaeda to operate under the covers, because now the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan isn't such a threat to the Pakistani state. It's more of a localized threat in particular remote areas of Pakistan, and less so against when it was marching and it was operating and controlling territory in Buner, which was 60 miles from the Pakistani capital of Islamabad back in, I think that was 2009 that was going on. And that's what triggered the Pakistani military to finally take on the bad Taliban. So, we've seen reports over the years where I believe one of them was even in the Washington Post, where it estimated the Taliban had Al Qaeda had thousands of fighters.
1,000. I think it was 1,000 in Karachi. Yeah, 1,000 in Karachi.
Karachi, but we know historical locations for Al Qaeda inside it. They're in Peshawar, they're in Quetta, they're in a host of countries where we've rounded up several key Al Qaeda leaders. Let's get into that a little bit more. But I gotta take a moment here to pause on the phrase you just introduced into our sort of dictionary now on this, which is the under the covers, because that immediately leads to me to another new episode we have to do, which is sort of Al Qaeda under the covers, a sultry night in a guest house in Peshawar or something. I mean, basically, that's sort of where my mind goes with that, because and so when it comes to under the covers, I mean, you had as part of this campaign, the Trump administration, I think it was the Trump administration, right, designated the Ganj Madrasa or Sheikh Amanullah in Peshawar, right? And Tom, I think that was under the Obama administration.
Yeah, maybe it was. Who cares? The bottom line is the U.S. knows that this guy is running this madrasa, which is in Al Qaeda's camp, right? And there's other facilities like that throughout Pakistan, and we don't really have a full public accounting of any of this, right? There's not any effort to say, here's what this total picture looks like. And there's another issue there too, which is we often talk about this alphabet soup of Pakistani jihadist groups, many of which are on the wheel of jihad, all of which are on the wheel of jihad. They either receive direct sponsorship from the Pakistani state or have in the past, and a number of them are known to have alliances with Al Qaeda or relationships with Al Qaeda, even though we don't know the full extent of them. And so I'm thinking here, you have like Jaish-e-Mohammed or Lashkar-e-Taiba, Huji or Harakat al-Mujahideen, all these groups that have been operating through the years. Now, some of them we know, as you wrote up years ago in 2014, were folded into Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, which fights in the Taliban's banner in Afghanistan, operates in Pakistan, and is exporting the jihad to Kashmir and elsewhere, standing up operations. But these groups, we don't really even know how extensive they are in Pakistan right now. I mean, we don't know what their footprint looks like, and it's not to say that they're all that the correlation between them and Al Qaeda is 1-to-1. We've never argued that, but we don't really know how extensive the correlation is. We know there's some, and we know there's enough historical evidence to say, for example, that part of Lashkar-e-Taiba has been wedded to Al Qaeda. Remember, there was that. Abu Faris al-Suri was that al-Qaeda veteran who showed up in Syria at one point working for Nusra as a spokesman. What was his dossier? What was his biography, the jihadi said? They said, well, he helped bin Laden establish Lashkar-e-Taiba. I was like, whoa, that's a pretty amazing claim to make about it. So that there is some, it doesn't mean, there are tensions there, of course, the Pakistani state, there is an argument within the jihadi scene in Pakistan. I've written a little bit about this, about the extent to which you can turn against the Pakistani state. Al Qaeda is trying to agitate to get more of the jihadis to turn against the Pakistani state in the long run, but it's all on this wheel of jihad. And I mean, what's your sense today, Bill, of how extensive these groups are in Pakistan and where this all goes? I mean, we've seen some recent reporting that even the Pakistanis were trying to free up some cash for some of these guys. I think it was even including Hafez Saeed, right? Who was the head of Lashkar-e-Taiba, right? And that are great allies in the Pakistani state. Thank you, guys, after all these years for so wholeheartedly endorsing the war on terror, and all this stuff. I mean, how extensive is this? I mean, what's going to be the issue going forward here?
Yeah, look, I don't think things have improved any than it was, let's say, in 2010 or 2005. I actually think these groups are more entrenched. Look, there's two reasons for this black box, right? And I think it's important to understand why we don't know what's happening. And one of them is the diminishing threat of the movement in the Taliban in Pakistan sort of decreased the need for the Pakistani media to get to the bottom of what's going on. So it's less important to report on violence attributed by the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan and who its allies are. And instead of reporting on political issues with Imran Khan, the prime minister, and his all the things he's doing, or COVID inside Pakistan. Those are, if I'm an avid reader of the Pakistani press, but I've also noticed another trend. There's been enough Pakistani journalists who've reported on these jihadist issues have been murdered, many by the Pakistani state over the course of the last 2 decades. And I think the Pakistani state has been suppressing a lot of, or discouraging a lot of the reporting inside of Pakistan on jihadist issues. Even when Pakistani soldiers are killed in North or South Waziristan, very rarely do these types of reports wind up in the Pakistani press. And I find that to be quite interesting. Those were big news stories in Pakistan in, let's say, 2008 or 2012, and now they're glossed over, or even so I think there's some self-censorship in the Pakistani press, plus there's some plus a push by the Pakistani state, particularly the Pakistani military and inter-service intelligence directorate, to discourage reporting on that. And given the history of Pakistan and the problems inherent with the wheel of jihad, and the fact, look, as you mentioned, I believe the Pakistanis went to the UN to try and free up money for, I believe it was around 50 known jihadists. And you're right, Hafez Saeed was one of them. And what do we learn about that report? Hafez Saeed supposedly was convicted of terrorism finance charges, right, last year. And he should be in a jail. But what do we learn in that latest report?
Yeah, let's give him some more money.
Back at home.
Yeah, let's give him some more money. Let's give a guy convicted on terrorism finance charges. We're going to give cash. Yeah,
because he needs it for expenses. But he's living at home. He's living under quote unquote house arrest. The guy's probably never spent a day in jail in his life. His home is a hub for for Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish, or Jamaatu Dawa, or whatever you want to call his group today, and the host of front groups, of so-called charitable fronts that he manages. Yeah, it's giving money to Hafezi, great idea. And this is how I know that these groups are just as prevalent today and are just as strong today as they were a decade ago.
Yeah, and I mean, Hafez Saeed's a guy who described Osama bin Laden as a martyr. He was clearly a bin Laden man, when bin Laden was killed in 2011. There's evidence of an overlap of part of Lashkar-e-Taiba, of course, with Al Qaeda going back to the Mumbai attacks. Yeah, David Headley, who did the surveillance work for the Mumbai attacks, ends up doing surveillance also for Al Qaeda in Denmark and elsewhere. Eventually imprisoned, and sort of you look through his case and it speaks to the wheel of jihad. Basically you have the Pakistani state in bed with Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is in bed with Al Qaeda, which creates this sort of incestuous sort of jihadi scene, which leads us back to Al Qaeda under the covers, I guess. But when you look at the whole scene here in Pakistan going forward. We previously have talked about how this is one of the big failures of the post 9/11 wars. Pakistan never really broke with the Taliban, of course, never broke with the Haqqanis, never gave up on this whole sort of waging jihad as acceptable part of their policy. And when we look going forward as the U.S. leaves the region, obviously Al Qaeda is trying to take advantage of that too by standing up forces in Kashmir. They have a small presence. We think they have a small presence in Kashmir. They do. They had Zakir Musa was their guy for a time. He was killed, and they've got other guys before him and after him. They're trying to basically spark an Al Qaeda style jihadi scene in Kashmir, which is a little bit different from a Pakistani state sponsored scene in Kashmir. We've noticed recently that Al Qaeda has sort of rebranded its public Urdu publication in the region to be Nawa Ghazwa e Hind, which is basically a reference to Kashmir and the Indian subcontinent and trying to export it and what they're doing. Of course, it's also filled with details about their cooperation with the Taliban on Al Qaeda Indian subcontinent. I mean, I can't really forecast what's going to happen with the Kashmir scene. Al Qaeda has a small footprint there. ISIS does too. I don't know. What do you think about that going forward, Bill, and all of this?
Yeah, and I think with Al Qaeda and the Islamic State's presence in the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir.
And by the way, I refer to it as Kashmir because that's how they refer to it. So
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, It allows for a release valve for the guys, the more hardcore. As if it's possible to be more hardcore than Jaish Mohammed or Lashkar-e-Taiba or Harkat al-Mujahideen or any of these other groups. But some of them want to continue fighting inside of Afghanistan. And just as Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent provided a sort of cover and a release valve for Pakistani jihadists to go in and fight inside Pakistan if they didn't want to do so alongside with the Taliban, with the actual movement of the Taliban in Pakistan or other groups. They were able to join AQIS and fight in Afghanistan and still are able to today. I think some of the because what the Pakistani state does is it'll dial up the pressure and turn it down inside Kashmir depending on, problems that it receives from sponsoring terrorist attacks inside of India, right? So if the heat gets too much, if there's too much international pressure, the Pakistani government will be like, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish Mohammed, look, let's dial this back. If you want to fight, go fight in Afghanistan. Well, some of these guys don't want to do that. And so what they'll do is they'll fight with inside of Al Qaeda. So I think there'll always be a place for them. But this and also these are some of these individuals really dislike the Pakistani state control of their jihad inside of Kashmir.
And that's the Al Qaeda argument. The Al Qaeda argument is Al Qaeda's been explicitly rhetorically attacking the Pakistani state to say, if you're beholden to the Pakistani state in Kashmir, we're doing jihad wrong. Come our way.
Yeah, and yet Al Qaeda recognizes that having groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish Mohammed and Harkat Mujahideen and Huji and all these other groups help their cause. They're practical enough to understand that these groups receiving the state support that they do helps their cause as well, because they rely on all of these terror groups and the Afghan Taliban, which of course is supported by the Pakistani state, in order for them to stick around. So it sort of gives everyone in the region an out to continue fighting using different modes. So long way of putting it, I think there'll always be a place for it, but I think there'll also be a place for the Pakistan supported jihadists as well as the outlier, which is the Islamic State, for them all to operate inside of India.
By the way, we know that these groups, in particular Lashkar-e-Taiba, but others as well, Huji, whom they've all had a footprint in Afghanistan. And Bill, have you seen anything from the Taliban admitting that these groups have a footprint in Afghanistan as a result of the February 29th deal with the State Department? Have you seen one word saying, hey, oh, by the way, these groups are all here fighting alongside us?
Not at all. And what, as we mentioned earlier, Al Qaeda itself is stating that it's impossible for them to do anything about Al Qaeda inside Afghanistan because Al Qaeda doesn't exist in Afghanistan. And it's also made a broader statement saying that about any terrorists, any foreign terrorists. This came after the Afghan Taliban said this after a UN report said that up to or an estimated 5,500 Pakistani jihadists alone were fighting inside Afghanistan. Some of those are many of them are part of the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan, but a number of those they estimated as somewhere around 800 were split between Jaish Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba, and that the other alphabet of soup of Pakistani terrorists are operating. And we know that, look, the State Department in a designation noted that Harkat al-Mujahideen, this was back in, I believe, in 2015 or 16, was operating training camps inside of Afghanistan. I inquired about that probably about a half a year ago, and they said that they believe those camps are still active. So, this is what's going on in the region.
And by the way, it was Harakat al-Mujahideen was implicated in bin Laden's support network in Pakistan, in Abbottabad, where his courier was known to be in touch from his cell phone, in touch with Hume guys, which we know there's a whole relationship there that goes back many years, so it's not surprising. But this is why the wheel of jihad matters. Let's talk about a little bit about the other countries in the region. So India, you had the Mumbai attacks in 2008. You have periodic attempts to attack in India through the years. Since then, what is that scene going to look like going forward? I mean, obviously they have to worry about the Kashmiri jihadis and others. I'm curious as to I don't know what the Indians think the extent of these international or global jihadists' footprint in India itself is. There's certainly some there, but I'm not really sure exactly how extensive it is. You have any idea on that, Bill?
No, it's very difficult to judge. I know the Indians are
Is that another
always
black
concerned.
box? Is that another black box?
Sort of. The Indians' primary concern are the Pakistani state-sponsored jihadist groups. They are concerned about the Islamic State and they are concerned about Al Qaeda, but they view those two groups in the lens of being supported by the state of Pakistan. In some ways, they're right, given that Pakistan has allowed these groups to survive and thrive merely by supporting the Pakistani state-sponsored groups. Look, I know Indian intelligence officials that'll tell you that they believe that the Islamic State Khorasan province is directly supported by the Pakistani military and intelligence services. I haven't seen evidence of this. I wouldn't be surprised if it might have been encouraged or supported by individuals within it. But I think the Islamic State, itself really goes against the Pakistani establishment's network that it supported up, because it's against the Afghan Taliban.
Yeah, it's so openly opposed to the Taliban groups. And the Khanis.
Yeah,
so there have been some allegations.
Problems.
There are a bunch of allegations that ISIS in the region has been marionetted by others, been puppeteered by others.
Sure. Even the United States. So.
Right. I mean, sometimes, look, a lot of these matters are murky. There could be, the UN even had reporting that Khanis were clandestinely sponsoring ISIS-claimed attacks because they just didn't want them to claim them as their own. Is anything possible? Sure, but of course it all comes down to whether or not you can actually see. You and I can see evidence of it, and we're not aware of any evidence of it. But it's always convenient for everybody to claim that ISIS is puppeteered by others, right? I mean, it's the same thing in Syria, where it was all according to some ideologues, it was all a function of Assad, right? No, it wasn't. Or in Iraq, it's a function of this or that, and in all these places, it sort of takes away the agency from the group and doesn't give them credit or give them their due as their own independent organization.
Look, I wouldn't be surprised if the Haqqani network was sort of looking the other way while the Islamic State was conducting some activities and conducting attacks that it doesn't want hung on itself that help destabilize the Afghan government. That in some ways makes sense. I need to see evidence of it in order to believe.
And on the other hand, we know the Connies and the Taliban and Al Qaeda, by the way, are leading the fight against the ISIS in eastern Afghanistan, or have clashed with them numerous times. So it's all a mess. But so I'm just curious about the Indian scene going forward. I feel like this is one of those countries and one of these scenes where that story isn't fully written yet, you know,
it's not.
There's probably more coming there. We're going to find out what it's going to be more along the lines of another attempted big terrorist attack as opposed to a full blown insurgency. But you know those are something along those lines is going to come in years, in months following here. In months to come here, I wouldn't be surprised if we find ourselves writing up something along those lines. You know.
Yeah, I mean, remember mid 2000s to late 2000s, there was a lot of terrorist attacks on trains, attacks in cities in India. That sort of died down, particularly after Mumbai, after the international pressure on Pakistan dialed up. Then you've seen some individual attacks here and there that the Pakistanis, of course, disavowed. But, you know, I think that and I hate to bring this all back to Afghanistan, but the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and the deal with the Taliban is going to embolden the Pakistani state to probably take some more risks when it comes to India, particularly in Kashmir, in and around Kashmir, and try and provoke. That's just how I feel things will happen. The Pakistanis have to be emboldened to know that their policy of strategic death, of supporting jihadist groups to further its foreign policy, pays off in the long run, because it worked against the United States. So why shouldn't it work against other countries as well?
So now, outside of India, of course, you have jihadi scene in Bangladesh. Al Qaeda made some early forays into Bangladesh. You had the Ansar al-Islam group, Ansarullah Bangla. You know, they claimed a series of attacks that were meant to kill the so-called blasphemers, atheists, bloggers, these types of people who are deemed to be outside the bounds of Islam. It was part of a global campaign, actually, that included the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris. This was all part of their global rhetoric, which is the idea that Al Qaeda was going to avenge the Prophet Muhammad and anybody who had blasphemed him or was a so-called apostate. And infidels, they did this as a part of a global campaign. They had a string of sort of small-scale attacks that were claimed in Bangladesh, but overall, you know, ISIS, of course, then established its own presence in Bangladesh, carving out from that and recruiting its own local jihadis and others into the scene. They're going to have some presence there going forward. It's tough to get a handle on how extensive that is there, right, Bill?
Yeah, it is. I mean, look, you know, the same thing with say, Burma, right? Myanmar.
Well,
right?
Burma's where I was going next, so yeah. So that's good.
They're very similar in that they have a presence.
Although I think we've seen more reported operations in Bangladesh than Burma, of course.
Absolutely, absolutely. But we're not looking at, say, Afghanistan or Kashmir level violence in a place like Bangladesh. It's really difficult, you know. And again, you had that's a whole long story, but the Pakistani state is sponsored the jihadist JUI Bangladesh, right? Jaish Islami Bangladesh, right, was one group supported by the Pakistani state. How much of that, you know, the Bangladeshi government came down hard on them, and I believe it even executed the leader of its group several years ago. But, you know, you still have remnants of these groups, and it's really hard to see. You know, again, these are the ones that are really difficult to predict, the South Asian countries, because we just don't see reporting on it like we used to. I don't know if it's because they've lost their presence, is the fragmentation between the JUIB and Al Qaeda and the Islamic State. Has it sort of carved up the pie in too many small pieces to make it not be meaningful, or are they just sort of laying low, or has the particularly Bangladeshi state cracked down hard enough to make these groups irrelevant? It's hard to say.
Yeah, so Burma is a case where Al Qaeda was agitating to do more.
Yeah.
We even had statements from AQAP, we're going to get to him, the current leader of AQAP, Khalid Batarfi, and others were calling to try and, you know, spark the jihadi scene in Burma. I've seen very little evidence along those lines. You know, I'm sure there are people who are more of an expert on that than I am in terms of looking at that, but nothing comes strong to mind right away that says that they've established a major foothold there, even though that's a humanitarian crisis and a messy scene as it is, you know.
Yeah, largely aspirational there and propaganda oriented, but I've yet to see anything real materialize out of that. That's not to dismiss it as a threat. You certainly have an oppressed Muslim population there, population oppressed by the government. It certainly is fodder for groups like Al Qaeda and the Islamic State to take advantage of, but we just really haven't seen that materialize at this time.
All right, so let's go to Iran next up on our list. This is, of course, as you know, one of my favorite topics because you immediately get into conspiracy theory world in Washington and all the hackery around this issue that's been reported through the years. But we know this. I mean, the bottom line is that we know based on what an Al Qaeda guy himself said about it, and what Al Qaeda had said about it, and what the State Department and what the UN have said about it, that two major Al Qaeda figures, two lieutenants, Ayman Al-Zawahiri, part of his senior management team, Saif al-Adil and Abu Muhammad al-Masri, are in Iran. And they were previously held in some form of detention there, but there was this exchange or reported exchange for an Iranian diplomat who was kidnapped by Al Qaeda in 2015. And three of their comrades left Iran and were killed subsequently in Syria. They decided eventually to stay in Iran where they can manage affairs. And according to multiple pieces of evidence, they have been playing a role in Zawahiri's international network and managing affairs there in Iran. This is the State Department in recent years has increased the bounty for information on them. It was one of those curious things. The State Department says, we want information on their whereabouts, even though they know they're in Iran. Everybody knows they're in Iran. And then it doesn't say, but we know they're in Iran. Why didn't they say that about the reward for information offer they offered for them? But you can see from other reporting, everybody knows that they're in Iran, other State Department sources. And also the UN Security Council, this expert panel that reports to them, we know they're in Iran. So as far as we're concerned, they're still there. Both these guys are on the succession chain for Zawahiri. So if Zawahiri is killed or captured or incapacitated or coronavirus gets him, I guess this is one case in which we're rooting for COVID-19 because apparently the U.S. military isn't going to get him east or Afghanistan as far as we can tell right now, but maybe COVID will. But Zawahiri, if he perishes or is incapacitated, both these guys are on dock to replace him. I don't think they could replace him from inside Iran. They'd have to leave. It'd be too controversial in the Sunni jihadi scene for them to leave Al Qaeda's global network inside Iran, but they're playing a management role now. And we know there are multiple others inside Iran that have been identified through the years. So, for example, in 2016, the Obama administration, the Treasury Department came out with a list of designations for 3 different senior Al Qaeda terrorists, all of whom were in Iran. The one who caught my attention right away there was Abu Hamza al-Khalidi. This is a guy who we found was mentioned in the Bin Laden files as part of a new generation who was groomed to take over a leadership role. He's worked with other Al Qaeda groups and other Al Qaeda affiliated groups, including the Pakistani Taliban. And interestingly enough, the Obama administration identified him as the head of Al Qaeda's military committee. Well, wow. And he was inside Iran leading their military affairs. And there were 2 others who were on that list as well who were playing this role. And then there was a series of other designations by the Obama administration and other official sources that identified a network that was part of an agreement between Al Qaeda and Iran. There was a facilitation network. It was initially headed by a guy known as Yassin al-Suri, who was originally from Kurdistan. It's sort of dubious as to whether or not he's actually in Iran today. He may have moved to Syria or elsewhere. But there's a whole string of these guys that we can identify. They were running this key facilitation pipeline. And just recently in the Country Reports on Terrorism the State Department put out, they identified this pipeline is still going, that Al Qaeda still has this facilitation network inside Iran to this day. Isn't that remarkable, Bill, that after all these years, just as the Pakistani state never really was forced to or never decided to break with its jihadi clients and allies, that Iran, even though it's opposed to Al Qaeda in many ways, and the 2 are at loggerheads in Syria and Yemen and elsewhere in so many different ways, this relationship remains unbroken.
Yeah, it's, look, I think one of the biggest fallacies in our field is that Shia Iran and Sunni Al Qaeda could never coexist together. And I think these designations and all of the other reporting and analysis out there shows that this is absolutely wrong. If they were such enemies, how was these Al Qaeda leaders who were designated, and it's not just 1 or 2, it's many, how are they able to survive and serve as financial leaders, military leaders, facilitators for people moving inside and outside of Afghanistan and such and such? These are key members of Al Qaeda's network. And unlike a place like Yemen or Afghanistan or even Pakistan. We conducted over 400 drone strikes in Pakistan against Al Qaeda, and even did a raid against to kill Osama bin Laden. But we're not going to do those sort of things inside of Iran. So that makes Iran a key hub for its operations. And we're not sending special operations teams there, and we're not sending drones there. It's probably one of if not the most untouchable place on the planet for Al Qaeda to operate, unless it's a place like China or Russia, and we see no indication of that.
Yeah, I think you could see in the decisions made by Al Qaeda, by these Al Qaeda leaders, including Saif al-Adil and Abu Muhammad al-Masri, their comrades who were released from Iranian custody go to Syria, some of them do, and they get killed. They get droned pretty quickly by the U.S., and yet they're alive because they decided to stay in Iran. Now I think if Zawahiri were to perish and one of them were to take over, he'd have to leave Iran, because you're not going to have this is one area where it would become a perception problem, and for the rank and file to say you're going to have the leader of Sunni Al Qaeda inside Iran, the overall emir. But you can see in these designations and other official reporting that this entire apparatus is there. And when I just mentioned Abu Hamza al-Khalidi, one of these guys who was identified as the leader of Al Qaeda fighters in Afghanistan, who sort of graduates up the chain and becomes somebody who's groomed to become part of this new generation of leaders for Al Qaeda. When the Treasury Department revealed he was in Iran, they said he was the head of the military committee, as I mentioned. And here, let's just do another epistemological question, and we're going to sprinkle these epistemological questions throughout this whole podcast. What does Al Qaeda's committee structure look like to this day? Right? We haven't seen an assessment from the U.S. government publicly, at least, in quite some time. The 2004 9/11 Commission report provided an overview of the committees. They said, here are the committees, and here's the basic job functions for them. We've had mentions of the Al Qaeda committees and things that they've said publicly. And when ISIS was agitating against Al Qaeda, there was some mention in Dabiq of different committees that were operating in South Asia, including a security committee. And so some of this stuff comes up, but overall, there's not been any official sort of analysis to say, here's what Al Qaeda looks like, not just from Zawahiri and the guys underneath him who are their subordinates in the chain of command. And here's what the global management team of Al Qaeda looks like. They refer to as the general command. But here's who's on the Shura Council. We've identified some of those guys through the years, but we don't have a full accounting of that. And then here's what the committee infrastructure under them looks like. We know Al Qaeda's had this, or a version of it, since the late 1980s, and yet we haven't had an up-to-date analysis of this in quite some time, right, Bill?
Yeah, it's a known unknown for us, right? Like we have no idea, other than getting scraps, bits and pieces, as you noted, from arguments from parts of the Bin Laden files, which are now almost a decade old. And again, as you noted, I see very little effort by the U.S. government to explain to us what Al Qaeda's committee structure looks like and what it means. We know that Al Qaeda has branches, right? We know that branch leaders do play an important role.
You're getting ahead of me here, Bill. That was next on my list. Stay with the committee.
Yeah, well, we'll stay with the committee then. Yeah, but right. They are, right? They're part of these. Right. We know that these leaders are part of the committees. So, but we only know this because it comes out in drips and drabs based on leaks, like you said, due to arguments, due to certain files leaking, things of that.
Pieces and designations. There are pieces and designations, that sort of thing. Yeah, pieces here and there. But there's never been this full, robust accounting. Just as there hasn't been a robust accounting of what Al Qaeda looks like in Afghanistan, there's not a full, robust accounting of what Al Qaeda's management structure actually looks like. You mentioned in the arguments pieces come out. I wrote up a couple years ago. These handwritten letters that came out as part of the argument between Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria and some of his critics in Syria. And these were letters showing the chain of succession under Zawahiri at the time. These are old letters now. They're very dated, but it shows that there was a succession plan in place. If Zawahiri dies, next up on the list would be this guy, and then this guy, and this guy. And these members of the Shura Council signed off on it. So that gave us good intelligence on who the Shura Council members were and what the succession line looked like. And some of those guys, the succession line, including Saif al-Adil and Abu Muhammad al-Masri, are still alive to this day and in Iran, interestingly enough. But who else is on that now? Who's part of the succession chain now? How does that work? Who's on the Shura Council now? How has this been reconfigured, reorganized? All that stuff, it's interesting how much of our field talks about this stuff and these basic questions about what this thing actually looks like. Very rarely are they asked, let alone answered.
Yeah, and Tom, just one more piece too. I mean, we learned a lot about Al Qaeda's, who was on the committees, and what the committee structures like during the drone campaign in Pakistan and also in Yemen, right?
Yeah, good point.
We would find it, but we'd find out after the fact. This guy was a member of the Shura and also on the military council, and this guy, that's how we would see things. But it was always after the fact. We never had a real clear picture, or haven't had a real clear picture of what Al Qaeda looks like for quite some time. Decade longer. I mean, I'm just sort of guessing. I can't remember the last time looking at a very clear picture of what that looked like.
Yeah, no, I can't either. It's been quite some time, and it just speaks to the basic foundational knowledge problems at the heart of what was formerly known as the global war on terror. That the stuff is still not updated, and reported on regularly. You talk about, the media committee, which is always such a big part of Al Qaeda's operations, for example. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed played a leading role in it, Mastermind 9/11. Other leading figures of an Al Qaeda's organization have played leading roles in As-Sahab, the main central hub for Al Qaeda media. We know As-Sahab is operating, and they haven't been taken out of the game. Now, they never developed a media apparatus as prolific as ISIS. ISIS has always outpaced them in terms of media production, even when they took their biggest lumps. But what does that look like today? What does the As-Sahab media committee look like?
Right.
In terms of who's running it, who's underneath them, how many people are they? How's it organized? I mean, we talk about now we're gonna transition build to the regional branches and that stuff.
Sure.
So we talk about this hierarchy within Al Qaeda. One of the things we know is that it's not limited to AFPAC, right? It's not, these senior Al Qaeda members, guys who are part of the global management team. There was always this idea that the Al Qaeda core is in Pakistan or Afghanistan, and then everything else is sort of affiliates. But that was always a false dichotomy or assumption in the analysis. It was proven many times to be wrong in many different ways. I mean, you can point to guys like Abu al-Khair al-Mazri in Syria, who was killed in 2017 in a drone strike. He was the top deputy Ayman Al-Zawahiri at the time. He was one of the top Al-Qaeda leaders on the planet. He's in Syria, not in Pakistan or Afghanistan. Nazar al-Waheishi was the emir of AQAP. We know he was the deputy emir of Al-Qaeda, and also at one point in time, its so-called general manager. We can identify these guys through the years who were obviously bigwigs. This so-called core of Al-Qaeda was sort of this abstract concept that was never fully defined, but generally referred to a geographic presence as opposed to the actual personnel. It was never defined by the actual personnel, which is part of the problem here in defining Al-Qaeda that we've experienced in the U.S. government, is that if you're not looking at the people and defining the organization by the people and the personnel, but instead letting these sort of concepts or these ideas sort of stick, you're going to get it wrong, and it's not going to meet the standards that you should have for the analytical standards that we all should have, right, Bill?
Yeah, I think I agree completely. I think this core paradigm that really came up during the Obama administration was used to justify.
It started during the Bush administration,
Yep.
But it became enshrined as sort of a dogma within analytic circles during the Obama administration because it was all driven by policy. But go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. And that policy was, let's defeat Al Qaeda so we can disengage from the region. And that's really, I think, why it really gained hold and stuck with the Obama administration. Remember, the Bush administration started the drone campaign. The Obama administration jacked it up, the drone campaign in Pakistan, right? And it targeted many key leaders of Al Qaeda, military leaders, members of the Shura, successive general managers, and and whatnot. I got a list of scores of these guys that were killed in the drone campaign. But like you said, it did. What about Nasser al-Waheishi? What about Drukdel? And what about all of these guys?
Again, you get ahead of me with the Drukdel bomb. You drop Drukdel and you get ahead of me.
So these guys were part of, if they're not core Al Qaeda members, then the term has no meaning whatsoever. And they are. They're the head of the Al Qaeda's branches, what people like to call affiliates. I prefer branches. They are members. They are core members of Al Qaeda's core because they are managing Al Qaeda's military, what Al Qaeda calls this is what Al Qaeda defines them as, their theaters, right?
Right.
Al Qaeda in North Africa, or Al Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, Al Qaeda East Africa, which primarily is Shabab, and Al Qaeda in the Islamic I'm sorry, in the Indian subcontinent, the JNIM in West Africa. These are all Al Qaeda's branches. The leader of those, without a doubt, in my mind, are key members of Al Qaeda's core. I mean, we killed Asim Umar in Afghanistan, in Helmand province in 2019. His courier to Ayman Al-Zawahiri was killed alongside him. He's in direct communication with Zawahiri, and that shows the import of these individuals. Not everyone gets a courier to Al Qaeda's Emir. It's just not something they give away randomly. You've got to be someone if you have a direct line to Zawahiri.
So this speaks to a fundamental issue here that we're going to do another separate podcast dedicated just to the Iran Al Qaeda issue. Eventually, I've had a couple of people ask me for that even recently. We're going to do that, and we're going to do a separate series of podcasts on the Bin Laden files when we get to that. That takes a lot of planning and writing. We're working on it. But when we advocated for the release of the Bin Laden files, one of the main reason really was because it got to this issue of what does Al Qaeda look like, right? And there was this whole issue that the prevailing assumption at the time was that at the time of his death was Osama bin Laden was more of a figurehead than an actual day-to-day manager. He wasn't really overseeing operations so much as sort of a talking head who was sort of provide the ideological or personal glue. His personal touch was a glue for the network, but he wasn't basically this guy who was actually overseeing things. Whoops, the files recovered in Abbottabad show quite the opposite. You can see multiple sources now have confirmed what we thought, which was that not only was he managing the operation, but he was even micromanaging it. You can see this in Mike Morell's book, The Great War. You can see in other reporting it was done. It was accurate. That reporting is correct. That analysis is correct when you actually look at the files as we've been doing. But that's another major epistemological flaw here in understanding Al Qaeda. I keep coming back to this. Just think about that. As of 2011, the U.S. government didn't even think that Osama bin Laden was running this thing really on a day-to-day basis, and he was. That's a big problem. And it wasn't just a political thing. I mean, I recently stumbled upon a quote from President Bush in 2006 saying that bin Laden's struggling to communicate, with others abroad, and whoops, that wasn't right. We've got all sorts of evidence from his compound that he was communicating during that time, and that paradigm stuck. Now, listen. The U.S. government should have corrected this baseline. I think some parts of it did, but overall maybe didn't. Should have corrected this baseline analysis of how Al Qaeda looks. But this leads to an obvious question, which I guarantee people aren't thinking about. If bin Laden was in control of this thing, well, how much is Zawahiri in control of this thing? And how does his operation look like? We have some evidence from the UN reporting and others that the guys in Iran, Saif al-Adil and Abu Muhammad al-Mazari, are playing a role in this. We've got some evidence from Syria with all the problems there that he's encountered, that he has been able to exercise some level of managerial control, although there's obviously a major problem there for him, a major headache. We're going to get into that in a second again. You can see that in other evidence globally. You see As-Sahab, the media outfit, constantly is referencing and glorifying the unity of Al Qaeda's branches with Al Qaeda senior leadership. When they have all these videos that come out from all the areas you talked about, Bill, and they put the media logos for these different shops for Shabab and for JNIM and AQIM and AQ senior leadership and AQAP. They show these media logos all side by side, emphasizing there is a global network here. Well, what does this look like, right? You mentioned Zawahiri's courier to Asim Omar. What does his actual managerial staff look like? How does he actually running this? What are the nuts and bolts? How is he communicating? All these questions. The bottom line was the U.S. government didn't really understand how bin Laden was doing it. I think you have a good reason based on that historical precedent to assume they probably don't really have a good full holistic accounting for how Zawahiri's doing it either.
Yeah, and Tom, it's other than some select individuals within the intelligence community, I don't think the U.S. government really cares all that much about how Al Qaeda is run at this point in time. And if they did, they wouldn't be pushing for this withdrawal from Afghanistan. And, to circle back to one point, look, this isn't just a problem with the Obama administration when talking about Al Qaeda's core. President Bush had some type of chart at his desk and with photographs.
This is one of our favorite comparisons, yeah.
Right? Yeah, and he would X off as soon as we would kill or capture one of these guys, and apparently got down to 75%. And that was a reason for, there to be such optimism that Al Qaeda was defeated, right? And that went back 2003, and then they did it again in 2004. I remember it went back years ago and wrote that up and, to see, how the Bush administration was looking at Al Qaeda and whether it was defeated. And they did the same type of thing that had the same problems that the Obama administration had. And so 19 plus years after 9/11, we still don't understand what Al Qaeda looks like or how it operates, how there's important operatives that we have no idea who they are, where they are, and what their importance is to the organization. These are problems that haven't gone away in 19 years, and I think we're going to have the same problems 19 years from now, given the history of this.
So you look at that, this is part of the common talking point that's stretched across two administrations now that Al Qaeda is decimated, right? And we've always puzzled at this use of the word decimated, because originally in its English language usage, decimated meant, decreased by 10%, basically you're down 10%. Which ain't so great, right? To say after all these years, Al Qaeda has been decimated in that regard wouldn't be so great. But of course, the English language usage has evolved, and decimated is meant to convey something where they're down to just a handful of guys, and they're really against it. But this is what we keep coming back to when we go through the history of the personnel of this stuff. What the implicit calculation there is that the starting number of Al Qaeda senior leaders, minus those who were killed or captured, right, or otherwise incapacitated for one reason or another. If you take those three out, the starting number minus killed, minus captured, minus otherwise incapacitated, that means that the result is that their number is actually, substantially reduced from what it was in 2001 or 2005 or whatever year you want to go to. The problem with that, as we've always said, that's not the full numerator, right? The full numerator, right? The denominator is just the starting number. The full numerator is the starting number minus those killed, minus those captured, minus those incapacitated, plus those who were groomed from within the ranks to assume a new leadership position. A guy like Qasem al-Rami, who was recently killed in Yemen, is a good example of that. Khalid Batarfi. We got a whole dossier of guys, a whole Rolodex of guys you could point to like that. So you have these guys who were part of the original base, who were trained by Al-Qaeda, and ultimately they're groomed to become new leaders. I mentioned Abu Hamza al-Khalidi in Iran, for example, as the head of the military commission. So you have to factor in those guys as replacements. Then you have new guys who are recruited post 9/11 for one reason or another. They're drawn to the Jihad, and some of those guys have the talent to become new leaders within Al Qaeda, so they can replace fallen comrades. So you have the guys who are existing fighters who are groomed to become new leaders, and you have new fighters who get in the system, and lo and behold, they show leadership traits, and they're groomed up the system. Plus, then you have the guys who are poached from other allied jihadi groups, which is one of the dynamics we talked about, right? Where they poach from primarily the Pakistani groups, but others too. They bring them in and they replace them. So replace them with these guys they poach from other groups. So when you look at the whole numerator, the thing is that nobody can tell you what that actual number is, right? Nobody can actually tell you what does that equal, right? If you want to say that this thing is decimated, it's an actual calculation you have to make. You have to say starting number minus these variables, minus killed, captured, incapacitated, right? Plus guys who were groomed for new leadership positions who are already in the ranks, plus new guys who come along and are recruited and join in, plus the guys they poach, plus however else they're able to add human capital, and then divide that by the starting number. And what does that equal? And nobody can tell you, right? So when you actually talk about this, it's one of these things that's just really weird. People talk about this stuff and they make this assertion that Al-Qaeda's leadership ranks have been decimated. Yeah, we could point to dozens of guys who've been killed for years. Absolutely. But how many out of the total pool, right? Nobody can tell you that.
And Tom, and that pool has grown substantially since 9/11. We don't.
That's the insurgency point, right? That's the insurgency.
Yeah, exactly.
Point.
We don't know what the exact number of Al Qaeda was, but let's just. What did Al Qaeda look like on September 10th, 2001, the day before 9/11? You could argue they had several thousand fighters and leaders in Afghanistan, and then a smattering, operating.
Yeah, some people even put it down to several hundred, which is not. I don't think is anywhere accurate. 9/11 Commission report said that there are 5,000 to 10,000 guys went through Al Qaeda camps in Afghanistan between 1996 and September 2001. That's the starting base from which they're going to find new leaders, right? They're going to find guys to replace the fallen leaders, right?
Yeah. Right, exactly. And then, what was their presence in Yemen? What was their presence in North Africa?
Sort of a smattering.
It was a smattering elsewhere, right?
Right.
What do they have today? Where is Al Qaeda today? They have, 4 or 5 regional branches. How many Al Qaeda in Syria alone? let's do a conservative estimate and call it 5 to 10,000, right?
Syria's a nightmare. Let's not do Syria because we're gonna get to Syria. That's the big. We've already did an episode on the problems in Syria. I don't know what the number is in Syria.
I'm just
what a mess. Yeah,
run through just conservative number, right? Like let's say that number's 2,000. We're already at 9/11 numbers. Then you have Shabab. What's their number? I don't know. The U.S. The commander.
I think it's at least several thousand. It's
the AFRICOM said that they control a year ago. They said they control 25% of the country. Yes, a lot of that's rural, but they do control towns and villages. Yeah, it has to be several thousand. What about in Mali? What about in in West Africa in general? What about in AQIM in North Africa? What about inside Yemen? Look, two times in the last decade, they overran large areas of southern Yemen. Al Qaeda itself admitted that it lost around 500 fighters in one of those years. And yet it wasn't defeated. It came back and took over large areas again. Number has to be in the thousands inside of Yemen. I'm giving you low ball numbers here. I think those numbers.
I believe it, man. We've been talking about this for a long time. I know it's low. This is definitely the lower end of our estimates. Definitely.
Yeah, and again, like you said, the poaching and all that. The numbers of Al Qaeda fighters and leaders that it has to groom had to have gone from several thousand to tens of thousands. So, yes, they've lost talent. But again, Zawahiri, how long's he been in this game? How long is his successor going to have been in this game? We've made this argument numerous times, and this is why you and I think these arguments are just highly, highly flawed, to put it mildly.
Yeah, and I think one other factor we should add to my numerator there in my equation is defections to ISIS or other groups.
Yes, that's a good one.
They've lost some defections. Of course they did. That rankled them. That's a hit for them.
Al Qaeda via Jamia Islami Jamia Islami. It's been so long since I even talked about that group in Indonesia, or its defections in Philippines. I mean, those were major theaters for Al Qaeda in the 2000s, which have largely gone over.
It's somewhat murky right now. That's another area where it's murky what Al Qaeda actually looks like after those defections. Exactly right. Yeah,
it is. But I mean, like the Islamic State certainly has a more overt, significant presence that we could pronounce, is the right word, that we could detect at least. But yeah, I mean, those are two to me, very good examples, or Iraq as well, right? Al Qaeda in Iraq was one of its most prolific branches where it really lost it to the Islamic State. But they're still jihadists. They didn't go anywhere. They just joined a different group.
Yeah, well, I mean, you think about it. I mean, that's another one of those places where we have to do a separate episode is on Southeast Asia. Definitely, because I've done some reporting on how the Islamic State grew there. I mean, the Abu Sayyaf group was lost. I mean, that was the Abu Sayyaf group had a footprint, had a role in 9/11. In terms of guys coming through Southeast Asia for meetings and that kind of thing. And there's some ties there in terms of the personnel and everything and other major operations. And so, Al Qaeda lost that stuff. I do wonder what the reconfiguration here is going to look like in Southeast Asia going forward. I don't know. But let's go through these other countries real quick. Let's, just to give people a sense. So you mentioned Iraq. Al Qaeda has lost Iraq. I mean, there's no operational footprint that we can see right now. It doesn't mean they don't have something they're trying to groom from underneath ISIS there. There were always rumblings that they were trying to do that with some personnel, including some of Zarqawi's companions that were going to lead a new Al Qaeda effort. That didn't amount to much, if anything, as far as we can tell. I don't see any evidence of an operational footprint there now. There is some evidence in the Kurdish mountains and elsewhere that they're there, possibly as groups, but they don't have a big operational footprint as of this point. So they lost Iraq, right, Bill?
That's absolutely. Yeah. I would call Iraq a major, or Al Qaeda's biggest loss, without a doubt. Yeah.
Yep. So now we'll go to Syria. What a mess. You have Hurs al-Din, the Guardians of the Religion Organization. You have these other groups there. I mean, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is still considered by the UN and U.S. and Al Qaeda affiliate. Obviously, there are big management problems there. I don't think we still know the whole story there. We're going to find out, I think, going forward more about that. There's definitely a conflict there. I wouldn't say that story has fully been written. I don't trust any of the full accounts of that and what actually happened there. But I think we're only seeing pieces of it.
Yeah.
But the problem with Syria is you have other groups like the Turkestan Islamic Party, which we know is still part of the Al Qaeda network, it still announces itself. It's allied with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham on the one hand, and yet is still firmly in the Al Qaeda camp. You have other groups, the Chechens. You have smaller Chechen and Uzbek groups. They're all part of the Al Qaeda fold. We don't know what the Al Qaeda chain of command looks like in Syria overall, right? I mean, I mentioned earlier the As-Sahab, has those media logos for the different regional branches. So the way this works is Al Qaeda has regional emirs that are responsible for waging jihad in their regions. They're supposed to wage insurgencies against the local governance structure, lay the footprint for the Islamic Emirates, and then the goal in the long run, of course, this is far, far off at this point, not close to fruition, but the goal in the long run is to replace them with Islamic Emirates to join up in a caliphate, right? Well, we don't know who the regional branch leader is in Syria for Al Qaeda at this point. We don't know for sure. We know that Haris al-Din is in the fold. We know that its leadership are clearly Al Qaeda guys. Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, who leads HTS, he was the regional leader for Al Qaeda, the regional emir. He did have an overt allegiance or bayat to Ayman Al-Zawahiri. There were rumblings that was broken as part of his rebranding effort, although Ayman Al-Zawahiri is suspiciously not disowned Jilani and has not formally said he's totally out of the camp. There are people who think he's still in the camp, but even though it's a strained relationship, there's, again, I keep using the word murky. That situation is murky. We don't really know. But the bottom line is they have assets in Syria. Al Qaeda has assets in Syria. And they have assets in Turkey, too, by the way. There's leadership. Remember, we've been tracking, Guy Mohammed Islambouli, who's mentioned in the Bin Laden files, who's clearly a senior Al Qaeda guy. There are other guys in Turkey. We don't know what the extent of the Al Qaeda network looks in Turkey, right, Bill? We don't know.
No, we don't. We don't. It's, as you said, murky is the best way to put it there.
Yeah, I'm going to keep saying that, unfortunately. So I guess I probably should use, I got to get a thesaurus up on Google right now as we're recording this. Trying to
Cloudy.
Cloudy, right. Yeah, cloudy with a chance of jihad. So anyway.
Fog of war.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So let's quickly run through some of these other places, right? So the Sinai, Al Qaeda, ISIS has recently been bragging in Annaba, its weekly newsletter, and other publications that they basically have cleaned Al Qaeda's clock in the Sinai. Certainly, Al Qaeda had multiple chips in the Sinai. Not clear at this point what they've got left in terms of the network. ISIS appears to us to be the Wilayat Sinai. Sinai Province clears to be one of those areas where ISIS did actually surpass Al Qaeda apparently for right now. And in the mainland Egypt, basically have some sort of recruiting network of some sort, but it's not a major pronounced presence at all. Certainly nothing along the lines of major terrorist activity or insurgency at this point. Right, Bill? You agree with that?
By the way, of all the theaters, that's the one that actually surprised me the most, given how the Egyptian groups have always been in the Al Qaeda sphere. I've always
the most interesting part about that, the most interesting part of that one, well, also because AQAP helped stand up the guys in Sinai, according to multiple sources. Right. And then you had one of the interesting parts about that was Bruce Rydell reported years ago that Mohammed Zamar, who helped recruit the 9/11 hijackers in Germany, that basically ISIS had secured his release from a Syrian prison, and that he actually went to the Sinai or met with the Sinai guys in some capacity to get them to woo them for all the Al Qaeda causes. At that point, Al Qaeda had Ansar Jerusalem, which was sort of a covert Al Qaeda. Not so covert, I would say, but Al Qaeda, unofficial Al Qaeda group, even though it was all in name in the Sinai, and basically he helped get those guys to convert and throw in definitively with the ISIS cause. I don't know what the hell Mohammed Zamar is doing these days. I mean, if he's still alive in the game, where is he? I mean, that's an interesting question, right?
Yeah, sure.
But that was an interesting report of how they did that. So, anyway, Al Qaeda lost the Sinai. They don't have this. They have some presence there, but it's certainly been overshadowed by ISIS. You agree, right, Bill?
Yeah, completely.
Okay, so now Yemen, there were, ISIS did not overtake AQAP in Yemen. That didn't happen.
Not even close.
No, ISIS is there. They caused problems for AQAP, but AQAP is still the top dog in that theater. AQAP, of course, carried out this attack in December at the Naval Air Station Pensacola with the sleeper agent, Mohammed al-Shamrani, the second lieutenant in the Saudi military. We talked about him on a previous episode of the podcast. So they've still got some capacity to hit the West, which is troubling after all these years. But their insurgency footprint in Yemen, the UN says they got several thousand fighters. Again, we don't really know. They've been able to leverage these local assets and local allies to keep regenerating their capacity, like Sheikh Zindani and his university, Al-Aman University, and others that were sort of part of this whole network there in Yemen. It's a very complicated story again. But AQAP is still very much in the game, and its senior leader now, Khalid Batarfi. You and I have long said, or I've long said, and we've long identified these guys. They've got to be part of the Al Qaeda senior management chain. He's not just AQAP's leader; he's part of AQ senior management, right, Bill?
Yeah, you recognized him long ago as being an up-and-comer. And as an aside, how Zindani is still breathing at this point in time is beyond me, and I think it speaks volumes of the failures in this war.
And the Saudis actually welcomed him for some meetings in Saudi Arabia, even though defying international travel bans against him as a designated terrorist. During this multi-sided war in Yemen, it's one of those problems where he still has legitimacy in the region, and one of those guys they're able to leverage. He's a guy who was designated by the U.S. government, I think, in 2004, and they identified him as a one of the mentors for Osama bin Laden all the way back then. So and you can see in the bin Laden files that there's a reverence for him, or respect for him, even when they disagree with him. Another one of these parts of this. So let's go across the sea there to Somalia. You love Shabab. You've been talking about Shabab for a long time. The Shabab guys, they're very much in the game. If you're looking at Afghanistan trending up, Pakistan, we don't know, black box, but reasons for suspicion. Syria trending down. They got multiple problems, but still a big footprint. Who knows where that's going to go? Support networks in Turkey. Who knows? Support networks in Iran. Then Yemen. I don't want to say trending down, but they've clearly had their political project has definitely suffered setbacks. Yeah. So we'll keep an eye on that. There's an ebb and flow. Somalia trending up. What do you think, Bill?
Absolutely. I think outside of the Taliban, that Shabab probably wages the most effective insurgency on the jihadist insurgency on the planet. I think they've maintained their unity and cohesion. The Islamic State in Somalia, while it exists, is under a lot of pressure from Shabab. Shabab routinely goes out and culls the herd. They don't get a lot of Shabab's Amniyat, or its intelligence service, is really, really good at what it does. It suppresses any type of dissent within the organization. If someone even hints or dreams about joining the Islamic State, Amniyat pretty much goes after them. So, but they're also very, obviously the Somali government, Somali military is practically non-existent. They're propped up by the African Union and the U.S. military, and Shabab has been able to wage it. I think Shabab really might actually control more territory. I think they're kind of waiting for the African Union supposed to withdraw by, I think, the spring of next year, if I recall. I suspect Shabab is sort of in a waiting pattern, just like the Taliban is, and waiting for U.S. withdrawal, waiting for international withdrawal before it makes its move.
Yeah, and the U.S. obviously, you can see there's pressure from the Defense Department to get out of Africa. There's like 7,000 service members across Africa helping stand up, mostly there to help stand up local allies against the jihadis, and there's pressure to get those forces out. So that Shabab's not stupid. They know that's potentially on the table, that they're not going to have to worry about the U.S. Standing up its main enemies. We talked about there's this distinction between this phony distinction between the core and the affiliates everybody uses, or was very common and popular at one point in time. It still is in some circles. I look at a guy like, there's several guys in Shabab's senior chain of command who I suspect are probably Al Qaeda senior managers. The emir of Shabab, Abu Ubaidah Ahmad Ammar, Abu Ubaidah, he comments on events far outside of Somalia. He weighs in on events in Syria and Turkey's role and everything else in all this, and comments on this stuff. He seems to me like I wouldn't be surprised if he's on some sort of regional Shura council that's managing affairs for Al Qaeda globally. We've had hints that such a council exists.
These guys were definitely part of Al Qaeda's. I don't want to necessarily call them core, but they were key facilitators, key links to Al Qaeda's central general command, central leadership, however you want to put it, from the founding of Shabab and its predecessor, the Islamic courts. These guys were influential. So, it is certainly not unreasonable to think that Shabab's current emir, and I believe Zubair, their past emir, was a key player within Shabab as well, or within Al Qaeda's global leadership as well.
Yeah, and Sheikh Raye, the spokesman for Shabab, he's openly, announcing their undying allegiance to Is Aohiri. I wouldn't be surprised if he plays some sort of management role also, or at least some sort of advisory capacity. And there are probably other guys like that. Again, the U.S. government's doing nothing to really explain any of this to anybody, and there's really little incentive to do that. And Shabab is another one of those up and coming episodes of this podcast we're going to have to do. We're going to have to do that eventually here. So we'll move on from there from now because just we don't want to go on and on about all this. But let's do quickly. Let's do AQIM and JNIM. So Al Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb. We just recently talked about how Abdul Malik Drekdel Wadoud had been killed in this French-led operation with U.S. assistance. The French government says that he was the second deputy of Zawahiri and part of the Al Qaeda senior management team, which says in essence that he was not just the emir of this regional branch of Al Qaeda and AQAM, but was actually part of the Al Qaeda global team. There are guys underneath him, including his potential successors. I don't think we have a named successor yet for him as we record this.
We haven't. No,
we're keeping an eye out for that. But there are potential successors and guys there who we suspect, like Yusuf Anabi, and others who are probably part of the Al Qaeda global management team or advisory capacity in some regard too. Don't you think so, Bill? Isn't that an obvious angle of this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I think it goes without saying. I mean, it is, you shouldn't assume that there are key members in each of these branches that are not connected to the top leadership. There are key nodes, and it isn't just one guy. It wasn't just Drekdel. It wasn't just Zubair. It wasn't just Wuheshi in AQAP, right? There are multiple individuals. It's a fail-safe for Al Qaeda to keep its cohesiveness between its central command and its global leadership and the branches.
Yeah, and of course, Al Qaeda AQAM stood up this wing that's primarily responsible for jihad in West Africa, the JNIM, which is the English translates into English into the Group for Support of Islam and Muslims, which is this benign sounding name. Doesn't that sound friendly? They're just here to help. Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if Iyad Ghali, the head of JNIM, is also part of an AQ management team or on the advising. I mean, he's a guy who's definitely got the credentials for this. He's somebody who's well trusted in Al Qaeda circles, and they've groomed for a long time to do this. Is he part of the senior management team? I would guess so.
Absolutely, yeah.
Obviously, we're obviously speculating, but
but yeah,
and nobody's
I'd put good money on that one.
Yeah. Now, all right, so they've got, and they're operating at a pretty good pace in West Africa and Mali and the surrounding countries. We document that stuff all the time. Caleb Weiss, who writes for us, he does a lot of that stuff. He's sort of hot to trot in West Africa. Again, we're going to have him on in a future episode. Libya doesn't look so good at this point, right? I mean, but it's tough to say. It's another black box. We don't know. They've been operating, AQAM, we know, was operating through cutouts and front organizations through the years. So who knows, right?
Yeah, look, both the Islamic State and Al Qaeda's operations there have taken a hit, but it's hard to say where they are exactly. Look, all of these guys certainly didn't die, or captured. I just think what we've seen is them go underground for a bit to see where things shake out in Libya. I think that's what's happening. But again, it's anyone's guess.
I think it's a pretty good sketch of Al Qaeda in 2020, and it is a sketch. I mean, we're well over an hour into this episode. You and I could go on for many more hours on this stuff. But what we'll do is we'll break out some of the parts that we talked about today in separate pieces and deal with them in more depth. I think, dealing with AQAM and JNIM. We'll have Caleb on to talk about that stuff and his research, and we'll connect that to the historical work you and I have done on that. We'll do Shabab. We're going to end up doing Syria again. You know that, and we also have to happen. We also have to do an ISIS roundup too, and we've gotten requests. I've teased this in the past and put this on the list of the number of episodes we're going to get to. I promise. One of ISIS and Al Qaeda's competition and what that looks like and what ISIS looks like today. These are all topics we're going to cover in future episodes, right, Bill?
Yep, that absolutely.
Now, Bill, one of the things that came up online before we leave today. I sent you this link, this report on a website I hadn't even seen. I don't even know much about this website, but it was talking about the Casio F91W watch, which is the watch that's used by Al Qaeda. Now, I first came across this make and model in my research in the Guantanamo detainees years ago because one of the indications that somebody who traveled to Afghanistan for jihad was they were wearing this watch. And apparently it's got a good timer that's used for improvised explosive devices and that sort of thing. It's a very cheap looking digital watch. I don't appreciate the aesthetic of it whatsoever, but I could see that a lot of jihadis wear this thing. And I saw this report. What was the website I sent you a link to? I don't even know. I'm
not sure. I have the title of the article. It is, How did the Casio F91W become a terrorist icon? Unfortunately, I seem to have lost the link to that. Great show prep, Bill. Yeah, so just Google that name. You'll come across that article. And, look, I suggest you all drop what you're doing and read it because, look, everyone knows that I have a little thing for the Chechen style, right? Let's face it. Who doesn't love Ibn Khattab?
Yeah, you love the Islamic Caucasus Emirates aesthetic. You love their
you
merch.
love it. Look,
you love it. You love it. No, not you love it. You love it. Not me.
Listen,
yeah, you love it.
Tom, who doesn't love that Ushanka hat with the scattering of eclectic camouflage, Khattab's beret? It's so smart. Or Imre Kazka's Vogue logo T-shirts.
It definitely gave him a
snazzy sword adorned flags. You gotta love those things, man. Tom.
Listen, you go on about it. You've given this way too much thought. Listen,
no, Tom, admit it. Everyone loves it, and if you don't, listen.
Listen, we're filming this, and I can see a closet in the background when we're filming this. I'm seeing it on Zoom, and I'm wondering if you open that puppy, what's in there? And now you're talking about this stuff. That's what I'm wondering.
Look, if you can't appreciate that, you probably go to the jihadi fashion dorks like Johnny Walker Lind or Jihadi Jack. Those guys got no style and no flair. And then you're probably shopping at Kmart for your clothes. So let's just face it. And by the way, the Chechen jihadi fashion is so chic that it's in perhaps one of the best movies that discusses the global war on terror. And I know, Tom, it's one of your favorite movies as well, Teen America World Police. They're top jihadists in that. Is all Chechen.
I couldn't believe when whoever did the research for that really did hone in on the Chechen stuff. It's amazing,
Yeah. So look, now you're all aware of my bizarre, call it sick, fetishization of the Chechen jihadi style. Well, Tom's got a thing about watches here. It's very disturbing, folks. I wish I had recorded some of these.
I don't like cheap watches. I don't like the look of them. I just don't. And the jihadis
Tom will size you up based on your watch, just so you know. So if you're going to be in Tom's presence, you better understand what Tom's watches are all about. So, Tom, tell us about how you came across the F91W, that beautiful Casio watch, which, by the way, one's in the mail on the way to you. I know how much you love them, so I had to send you one.
Yeah, you're gonna get a video of me smashing that thing because it's just so cheap.
Well, come on, Tom. Hey, look, it's such a great watch, Tom. I mean, look,
the jihadis love it. The jihadis love it. You know what's funny is I came up on this. What's funny about it is this cheap watch, this piece of shit watch that the jihadis love.
$12.63, including tax and shipping, by the way.
The jihadis love. Apparently, this thing, the timing mechanism on it is so good that they can use it for explosives over and over again. So apparently, what it was, the reason why they ultimately used this watch originally was in these training camps in Afghanistan. It was something they could use to set up a timer for an explosive device. And by the way, the explosive devices they were using this thing or timer they weren't necessarily used for international terrorist attacks, although they could be. It was for insurgency, waging guerrilla warfare, which if you listen to this episode here and what we talked about in Al Qaeda 2020, a large part of what we're talking about is not necessarily their capacity to hit the West. We're going to deal with that again, of course, in the future. But really about their insurgency footprint and the fact that these guys were insurgents. And the F91W Casio watch was, something they used for their training to build these bombs. And as I mentioned, I originally was doing this research into Guantanamo, and it's one of the things that's throughout the files. And so years ago, when they kept referencing this watch, this make and model of watch, I had to look it up, and I was like, "Geez, come on, guys, really? This is the best you can do in terms of aesthetics here for a watch." And then it turns out that Bin Laden even wore one in one of his images. And I'm like, "Come on, man, you got to have something that's a little better looking than this thing."
That watch is actually the only piece of branded gear that Bin Laden was ever seen with, other than like an AK or something like that.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's it.
Wow.
That article discussed that. I thought that was
that's right. It's in that article. Yeah.
It's you're never going to catch the guy in Nike, but he'll wear the Casio F91W.
Yeah. Well, he had poor choices in that regard then too. Everything else. All right. Well, now you know one of my dark secrets, thanks to Bill, which is I have an anti-watch fetish. You know, there's certain watches I just don't like the make and models of them at all, and this is one of those ones that's just so cheap looking. You know.
Yeah. Well, so Tom, I got one more question about this. So when Baghdadi declared himself caliph in that video.
So that watch was not a Rolex. I mean, you can see some reporting. People were questioning right away, is this thing a Rolex? No, Baghdadi's not wearing a Rolex. I mean, the watch wasn't terrible, but it wasn't a Rolex, you know? I mean, don't try and pass this thing off as a Rolex to me. I mean, I saw some of the people questioning that, and I was like, come on, you don't know your watches.
When that video first came out, the first thing Tom says to me is, did you see that watch that he was wearing? I swear to you, that was the first thing that...
You know who has a watch fetish, too, is Sheikh Muhazni in Syria. That guy's always wearing different make and models of watches, you know?
No, do you like his watches?
I mean, some of them are okay, you know? I mean, you know...
See?
He's a big fan of ours, so if he's listening to this, you know, or has somebody translate it for him, he can get a kick out of that, even though he doesn't...
Well, Tom, just keep this in mind. Muhazni will never send you a watch, but I will.
Yeah, well, on that note... Any event, so now you got to look into some of the more bizarre aspects of the Long War Journal and our reporting on this through the years. Yes, I do track jihadi watches, and as disturbing as Bill's love affair with the Chechen jihadi scenes aesthetic is, you can now know something about mine and my own distaste for certain things. In any event, you know, we'll conclude on that note. So thank you again, everybody, for listening to this week's episode of Generation Jihad. Please do subscribe to the show. As a reminder, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to your shows. And we'll see you again next week.